Thank you very much for inviting me on St. Patrick's Day. And tonight I'm meant to be talking about making saints. I'm having to say that I agreed to do this before having a second bad bout of COVID. So it is not as sophisticated as I hoped to make it. So this may be a bit of a romp through how to make a saint. And I hope it won't be too boring for you if you are deep into the subject. I've done a lot of academic work in the fields of Gaelic Scandinavian context in the High Middle Ages. So there'll be a fair amount of that in the subject, which may be new to some people anyway. I'll also say that while I can see my own screen, full screen, I can't see anybody else. So if you've got any comments, perhaps you'll just put them in the chat. We seem to have a problem there. I've also, these are not very many slides again, but I'm a folklorist also by secondary training. And I would be very glad if you have comments to make about local saints, which you would like to discover. Anyway, making saints is an ongoing pattern for human beings, it seems. And you may like to see this 1965, I believe, window in memory of Kenneth MacLeod, who was the Gaelic interpreter for Marjorie Kennedy Fraser and is now one of the glass windows in Iona Abbey. A rather youthful, rather elegant Patrick, complete with communion cup on one side and high cross on the other, neither of which, of course, records is what anything like that would look like in the period of St. Columba in the 6th century, but it's all part of the continuing subject. Now, I'm going to be talking about St. Patrick, of course, today. After all, this is Ireland's day off of Lent, but also a fair amount about St. Columcille and his friends, including modern tales, because to understand making saints, we have to look at the ancient, but also the modern, the popular, the folk traditions, and a good grip on our own understanding. Now, I'm used to speaking to people face to face, and I'll try now, but as I can't see anybody, perhaps you'd use the chat to answer if you wish. So let's go right back to basics, as they say. Could anybody comment on what a saint is? What is a saint? Who becomes a saint? What do they do? What's their point? Are there any comments? I'm trying to scroll down to see if there are any. I've got past Ken's desire for donations. Somebody has mentioned miracles. Somebody else has said a martyr for their religion. I would go along with that as long as we use martyr in its full sense, the Greek word witness. One of the advantages of the saints of our period is that very few of them, if any, actually got killed for their religion. They may have lived in what was considered a form of martyrdom, including a very ascetic life and prayer for their family and for others. But
right.
Sorry, is somebody contributing verbally? But it is, there are various ways. So yes, miracles, a saint is a person who seems to work miracles. In our period, in the early period, very definitely miracles in their lifetime as well as anybody else. A spiritual mentor, anybody has said. Many antecedents, someone recognized by the church as making a significant contribution to their faith. Yes, but recognized by whom? And that is one of the interesting aspects of saints over the years. Somebody has said a convenient fiction for fleecing the flock. I think certainly a great deal of money was made out of saints in the past, particularly on the pilgrim routes. However, most of them actually had a historical background, at least the ones we're talking about today. Popular canonization in the early period, acclamation, yes, as indeed still occurs, I understand, in the Orthodox tradition. A saint is set apart by God. Interesting comment. Very much in the early period, we have people who seem to have been designated from birth for being the saint for their family group, as for example, Columcille, born pretty well into it, and therefore stories about their lives start with them as infants or even in the womb, where they start making miracles, and the model, of course, is Jesus. We, of course, have other saints who go through a life of sin first and a penitence. The classic one, of course, is Mary of Magdala from the Gospels. Many antecedents, some in prehistory, but in Christian tradition, they made miracles. One of the great saints talked about tonight certainly has precedents, and that is Bridget. Any believer, good theological point from someone, spiritual mentor figure, and so on. Anyway, there seem to be quite a few comments about what saints are, and I'll try and digest that. Active saints today are easier for understanding in the Catholic and Episcopalian traditions, of course, and modern saints. What do? They intercede. They heal, they provide models, depending on your theology. Quite often they preach. Who makes them saints? Patriarch or Pope. And of course, since the Reformation, there's been no new mechanism to make saints, though some people like Charles I are noted by the Anglican Communion and others. At the Reformation, of course, saints on the whole were rather demoted to models for a good life, rather less from a less ideal past, often seen as good in spite of corrupt church. Now, people, of course, still use the names of saints, just as they did and still do names from the scriptures of those parts of the medieval Bible which was deemed secondary worthy reading at the Reformation, on the basis that no known Hebrew originals were known for the Greek stories of the larger Old Testament. People still kept calling their daughters Judith, Susanna, and their sons Tobit and Tobias, just a few of those who got demoted at the time. Another example is, of course, that they are the communion of saints, the ones who have made it to heaven, to whom God listens and can help those on earth on their journey. And for a newly Christianized society, it was extremely important not only to have the universal saints, those of the scriptures and of the early church, but also, where possible, those of their own society, because people could relate to them. They were related by blood, by society, by culture, and were real in some real sense. And later, of course, after the period of the early Gallic saints of tonight, the same happened for the Norse, the Scandinavians, Christianized in the later Viking Age, and very important in the culture of Argyll and the Isles. So to start with, these are some modern interpretations as in stained glass windows. I'll stay with Iona Abbey. We have this 1960s version of St. Columba. Up in 1900. Now, are my slides going to move? I think one of my problems now is that the slides are not going to move. So I'm going to go out of the sharing and come back in again. And unfortunately, while you do see everything down the side, this might work better. except this is not working either. Oh yes, it is, slowly. Right. On the north presbytery windows of the rebuilt Iona Abbey between 1901 and 1910, you get three of the three great saints of Ireland. Here, of course, in green, you get Patrick, nearest the communion table. Next, in virginal white, Bridget. And thirdly, Columba, a rather older man and very much an activist. So as models, they were certainly acceptable in 1900 in the Abbey. And let's not forget, on the east side, a later saint, Margaret, the reformer of the late 11th century, who rebuilt parts of decaying Iona and is duly here, as in medieval form, with the tools of her trade, a large book under her arm, because she was a woman of learning. Beneath her feet, which may not show on this slide, she has the architect's tools, and hanging from her waist is, on a long belt, a purse, because, as we know from her biography, she would disperse her husband's money to people in need. Margaret, of course, is very much a historical figure, a Wessex princess who fled northwards after the Normans took power in England, a refugee, as we'd say today, who got a right to remain by the best way possible, by marrying the king, and who was illiterate. She was the reformer of many of the old monastic sites on the European model. She was highly educated. She had her two daughters educated in the south of England. One remained a nun for life. The other rather leapt over the convent wall and married one of William of Normandy's younger sons, Henry I, to the horror of the Norman lords, finding he was married to a Saxon princess with a father who had been King of Scots. But there she is, rather a formidable woman, and I'm afraid she's got a marvellous ectoplasmic wreath around her neck. That is an extremely well-developed cobweb, that's for real, and so old that it's almost part of the furniture that Historic Environment Scotland now looks over. And so we have the symbolism around her. And there she is, saint and queen, obviously useful in her own time and beyond for those who wanted a saint of their own. Her lifestyle obviously wasn't that of everybody, but as a wife, as a mother, she had various attributes which could benefit. Medieval saints from the early medieval period, what some would call the Dark Ages, and the high medieval period, have lots of uses, and some of them were specialized. You had the early Christian saints, the biblical ones like Paul or later, the early church, the Desert Fathers, the learned like Saint Jerome, the ones like Catherine of Alexandria, after whom Catherine wheels are named, the one who was put to death on a wheel, one of the martyrs by blood, the wonderful Margaret of Antioch, who was swallowed by a dragon, but took a knife with her and cut a way out and was made the patron saint of childbirth. Anthony, the Desert Father, who's also good for lost things. Jude the Apostle, good for lost causes. Christopher, disadvantaged by being non-existent, but the saint of travellers, the one who carried the Christ child across the river. There was an absolute outcry in the 1960s when he got sacked by the Vatican. Not that it made much difference to his popular appeal. And of course, for St. Nicholas, who provided dowries for impoverished girls, brought murdered and eaten children back to life, and now in diminished form still turns up as Santa Claus. So they had a wide range of uses. Intercession with God generally. There was also the pleasure that there were lots of holidays to celebrate them. There were personal days, usually the dates of their death or their translation, when their relics were moved to a shrine. Guilds and others, specialized church dedications. And all of these were part of the official calendar and a good time for recommendation. Some, of course, are still with us in some ways, like John the Baptist, whose feast is at midsummer. As he said in the Gospels, when Jesus came, he must increase and I must decrease. So there he is at the middle of the year when the days start getting shorter again. Others became festivals. Feast days like Michaelmas also had loads of secular uses. It was a rent day, a day for hiring fairs. It still is apparently used for certain rents, of course. The sacred and the secular interconnected for our ancestors didn't necessarily make great distinction. There was also the place where the saints' relics were to be found, or even the minor places connected, like associated birthplaces, became places of pilgrimage. Now, this, of course, was the holiday of the time. It could have been a group away day, or it could have been something that took years. Now, keepers of the shrines, nearly always clergy, got large income from donors and provided hospitality. Both monks and nuns did that, and so you also had a bit of income from those who could afford it. And for the clergy, masses for the dead, a very large source of income. It also, to run a shrine, needed quite a lot of local support because of food provision and other needs of travellers. Fresh horses, for example, boats across rivers, ferrymen. Some who could took pilgrimages that could take them years away. This, of course, goes back to the very early centuries where we have people like Egeria, the learned woman of considerable means who travelled around the Jerusalem and the holy places and wrote about it. Many whose names we don't know. The great medieval pilgrimages to Compostela spring to mind, dedicated to St. James the Apostle, believed to end his life there. Journeys to Jerusalem, and so on. And often people actually put their affairs in order and took off, and could be years on the road, possibly not returning at all, but being buried at one of the shrines and leaving money at these shrines. This development, of course, was increased during the 12th century onwards by the Crusaders' routes and the hospices for pilgrims on them. But for those who could not afford these long journeys, there were more local, homely routes. So in short, a saint was seen as someone who lived a life close to divine, that entered more deeply into a relationship with the divine, has consequences for the betterment of others through intercession, through model, through miracles that emulated Christ's healing, often of food multiplication or provision, and were often preachers. The monastic model of living apart was very popular in our part of the world. So we have a wide range of forms. Much of modern heritage studies would also talk about social control, but I think there was more freedom than that may express. Local cults and local practices and accretions of legends is a bottom-up approach. And while there was, particularly in later times, a formal top-down attempt to control who was in and who was out in terms of saints, as we'll see, I don't think we should be too dismissive of our ancestors' ability for independent thinking. Perhaps odder to us, is the way in which certain saints were seen as born to the job. They had this role within their kindred, as did Columcille. And therefore, like Christ in the apocryphal Gospels and in folk tradition, they performed these great feats in childhood. In the apocryphal traditions, there's a regular story of how Jesus and John the Baptist were playing as small boys, and they were making mud pies and then mud sparrows, except that Jesus blessed his and they flew away. One of my favourite saints from the west of Ireland is Saint Senan of Scattery Island in County Clare, who, as a baby in the womb, the baby in the arms of his mother, saw her stretch out her hands to pick some blackberries from a passing bush, and reprimanded her, saying, "It's not dinner time yet, mother. Restrain yourself." Continued much in that vein throughout life. So he did banish a wonderful monster. Of course, what we know of them doesn't necessarily, in fact, very little often, dates back to the time of their life. Legends accrued about them and got fixed in writing over time, and more legends accrued once they were in writing. One of the advantages of writing is it fixes stories, but to create a written work in our period was a major endeavour. First of all, the very process of creating parchment or vellum to write on, then the ink, and then having somebody competent as a scribe to write it down, something which often took months. But making books to hold lives was common. But of course, once you had these books and read them out to people, translating as you went from Latin or later on using vernacular lives in particular, you also got more stories because people say, and we've got something else. So in the early Middle Ages, saints are all by popular acclaim. Someone or a group, say a monastery or powerful family, promote the saint's interest, get popular approval, visiting shrines, etc., evidence of miracles, and become like the early church saints of scripture and so on, saints by popular acclaim. This could be problematical at times in the case of the obscure, the non-existent, or the disgraceful, as we'll see, but on the whole it worked. And the vast majority of these saints are of this kind. Not all lasted. How to do it? Well, a written version helps. And we are fortunate for three great saints of Ireland, all of whom functioned well in this part of the world as well. Patrick, Bridget, and Columcille all had the great advantage of having lives written down very early in Latin, but once you have it in Latin, you can have it translated, read aloud, and translated into vernacular. And written in ways often in chunks that could be read out to a religious community or to students, pilgrims, or other listeners. And when I'm speaking of Old and Middle Irish, it is to all intents the same language as spoken at that time in this part of the Highlands. But for various reasons, the written sources are largely preserved in Ireland. And the sources, not all of them sound very exciting. The first is the annals, year-by-year accounts of events. One of such account of annals was started on Iona, and early material has survived because it was incorporated into the later annals of the Ullad, now known inaccurately in English as the Annals of Ulster, the Ullad being the people of counties Antrim and Down, roughly speaking. Though obviously later editions, a Columba's year of birth was added, taken backwards from the year of his death, for example. The early entrants are useful if sparse. Martyrologies. There are two which are of particular interest from the Martyrology of Angus and the Martyrology of Tallaght, both very interconnected, verse with prose stories. A martyrology is a list of saints to be celebrated on any particular day. with martyr as the full sense of witness. This would include the international church saints, but also local ones. And these lists got expanded, and sometimes short accounts and stories were added to them. There is also a group of works called Dinchenachas, which is onomastics, place name studies. Names which are associated with church buildings like Kil, Anad, and so on, but also the more specific personal or associated names which could attribute a person to a certain area. And of course, we have lots of other words taken from Latin: desert, champel, donak, uglish, all of them denoted a church place or site. Incidentally, although I would like to give full credit to Patrick tonight, as it's his special day, he is very much associated with the spreading of Christianity in the northern part of Ireland. Before his time, there was Palladius, a bishop to the Irish. In the far south of Ireland, probably from trade routes from Frankish kingdoms, we get Declan and Ailbe, who doesn't seem to have had any burial place, for we're told he went and sailed west to the Isle of Promise, and his bones, if they reside anywhere, were found there in those islands to the west, which later Brenda the Navigator was to explore. Another source are genealogies, showing he's our saint, occasionally she, member and protector of, and a property of a specific family or site. And then the lives, often full of lovely stories. Some are quite obscure, and connected with those a bit shorter miracle collections. Miracles we'll find are often based on the miracles of Jesus, or of those which appear in the earliest of these lives, which spread widely, which was that of Martin of Tours, the 4th century Roman officer who turned pacifist, who turned monk, who turned founder in time of the monastery at Tours in the Frankish kingdom, where many other saints visited and trained, at least according to their saints' lives. His life was written shortly after his death by Sulpius Severus. By the way, that's Severus as in Severus Snape, for those who like Hogwarts. And it became a model for later biographies in its structure and its stories, its miracles, and particularly in its purpose. For these were not intended as biographies so much as moral fables, spiritual biographies at best, structured to be read out. And then, of course, ongoing tradition. And Columba covers all of these, as we may see. So the 3 great saints, Patrick, Bridget, and Columba, all got well established because they had their lives written in the 7th and 8th centuries. Patrick, as a saint, got a head start, for we actually have writings of his own. A brief account of his life and spiritual action, and a letter. Not necessarily by our standards as helpful as we'd like. The Confessio is a spiritual autobiography showing the workings of God through him, not the precise biographical detail we'd like. And much speaks of the glory of God through the Psalms. The other, the letter to the British chieftain Coroticus, is his demand that captives be freed, a theme which comes up again with Columba. Now, we do due honour to Patrick today, who may or may not have been buried at Downpatrick. Medieval legends had him in the same grave as Bridget, and to the horror of later custodians of Iona, Columcille, who in the 18th century called the Irish a pack of lies for putting him in Ireland. They were all rediscovered in the same grave in the 12th century, and again in the 13th, in both occasions for political reasons. There are many other places, of course, associated with Patrick. In southwest Scotland, around here, and of course in Ireland, at Straw Wells, the Holy Wells in County Down. His life and miracle collection were produced early on by people Myrchel and Odhran, and he's well established as that bringer of Christianity to Ireland. And many a child in Ireland today will be singing Duchas Limni Fadrig Aspon Morna Heron. Joy and hope to us, St. Patrick, the great saint of Ireland. And of course, he's associated with Armagh, the city that took over from the nearby and ancient royal site of Eamon. And the city of Armagh, even today, you can see the 3 concentric circles, which were considered the model for a monastery. Each inner circle representing a higher level of sanctity, of holiness. One of the models for the understanding of a monastic site, as we'll see on Iona, taken slightly differently. Now, Patrick was a historical figure. Later on, in this time of great repeating and extensions of saints' lives, he got a 3-part life as well. And of course, endless additions, accretions, well into the 17th and indeed 18th century, even though he was not one of the first. We have, in fact, 12 apostles of Ireland, who include Brendan, the navigator, very popular, who was seeking out the deserts in the ocean, not the hot, sandy places in Egypt, but the stonier, chillier deserts on the woodlands or islands of the West. Keeping penitential practices like the Desert Fathers were those people he met on these islands, as we're told in his later biography. Long vigils of prayer, some standing up to their necks in the ocean, which is one thing in the Nile or the Mediterranean and another in northern climes. No wonder St. Cuthbert of Northumbria had otters that came to warm his feet after he indulged in such practices. Secondly, we have Bridget. I'm inclined to believe that Bridget was a real figure as well, though her name and her site at Kildare have strong pre-Christian traditions, unusually over the difficulties in early Irish law that were inclined to make it hard for women's monastic foundations to establish and to persist. This was a female site from ancient times. Perhaps we can see her antecedents as Brieg, one of the female deities associated across these islands with fire and domesticated in this saint. Though Bridget is not a saint I would wish to cross, even in her domestic functioning. Cogitosus, the knowledgeable one, wrote her story up early. She was the daughter of a lord and a slave, so started humble. She became a nun, was consecrated a bishop by accident, which was no accident in an all-male clergy church. She was, and still is, associated with the provision of food, especially milk products. She was a protector, particularly of the vulnerable and the weak. A double monastery at Kildare with a great church, in which female and male monastics were ruled by her and in church sang together, partitioned by a wooden barrier, so they could hear but not see each other and be distracted, are all part of what is outlined in her lives. And so it went on. As late as the later 12th century, the Welsh adventurer and cleric on the make, Giraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, speaks of the sacred fire kept at Kildare, tended by the constant number of 19 virgin nuns. And on the 20th night, they leave the firewood out and tell Bridget, "Tend it for yourself tonight." And she does, of course. And here, Gerald, too, usually somewhat scoffing of things Irish, saw the work he describes as the work not of humans, but of angels. A work similar, but not the same as the Book of Kells as it currently is, complicated. At first sight, just a mass of spirals, but as you look more deeply, you understand the theology, the artistry, the contemplative power of the work. but equally fine, and there it was at Kildare. The Book of Kells itself is associated with Iona, seems to have been composed on the bicentenary, or around bicentenary, originally around the bicentenary of the death of Columba, Columcille, but never finished and probably taken to Kells for protection. Lots of other female saints, of course, who are rarely mentioned. To go back to the south of Ireland, there is Gobnate, whose similarities to name and her interest in her concern with fire, but also the name itself, indicate an origin as a smith goddess, that is of blacksmithing, that magic ability to turn a rough brown iron into ploughs, tools, and of course, weapons. And so Bridget has many dedicatory places. The third is, of course, Columcille, who also has many dedicatory sites on both islands, including as far west as County Clare, though whether another saint of similar name or similar nickname is the same saint or not is less certain. And we can get to him because we can trace all these different ages of saint making down the years, and I'll see what my slides are giving. Oh, right, well, you all know where Iona is. The tip, there it is. The island, it's a corncrake I put in simply because I was talking about them the other day. And these are the two sites we know today from the Aire, the Abbey, which is the northernmost, which of course is the Benedictine Abbey, but is established, particularly the church, very much on the inner sacred site of the original monastery. And somewhat to the south in the village is the secondary site of a nunnery, which I'll also come back to. Now, it's already 7:45, so I better hurry up. Lots of saints are rather lost because we don't have particular stories about them, like Odhran, of course, who possibly is the same saint for Iona and Odhransey. The saints were completely lost, like Bechna or Lechna of Iona. Adamnon, who deserves more attention and is the resurgence, at least academically, Merua of Bangor and Applecross, and so on. Or Colin Barnes, also from Bangor, who sailed away to Europe. Brenda the Navigator, Margaret, others. By the 12th century, we got many of these saints' lives being developed, included, changed. Margaret, of course, gets in because her life was written shortly after her death in 1093. Magnus of Orkney, to go a little bit further, is a rare condition, one of the martyrs. Miracles, and he lives on in the popular imagination. But his kinsman, Revered, the Crusader, poet, good ruler, chess player, never made it to formal sainthood, though his bones may have been hidden in the pier of a cathedral he founded. And there may be saints that are not normally spoken about. In the 12th century in Norway, a saint, is said, appears in Norway. Saint Sunniva, saint of the west coast. The story is that she was an Irish princess with an importunate but undesired suitor. She sailed away with her brother and other companions, got trapped and then killed in a cave by accident in Norway. Their bodies remained intact, and this nation, hungry with new Christianity and needing new saints, made her a saint. Everything about her indicates actually that from her name down to her sources suggests she was actually English, but there was a need for a Gallic saint at the time. From that point of view, we actually have a short-lived Hebridean saint in Norway. In 1130-ish, in 1130, Norway acquired an Irish king, Harold Gilly, at least Irish on his mother's side, possibly the illegitimate son of previous Norwegian king on his father's. He actually was king very brutally for 6 years, and then was killed when drunk and in bed with his mistress, and was yet proclaimed a saint. This was a year after he'd hanged the Bishop of Bergen, a fact that annoyed Rome in a putative saint. Extraordinary character. As a result, there is a letter written, a papal letter to Sweden, asking them not too readily to honour as saints men who had died in their cups, possibly a reference to this Norwegian affair. Harold Gilly of Ireland also called his daughters Bridget and Mary, and Bridget married into the Swedish royal house. Harold also had a Hebridean son called Eystein, who also became king of Norway for 15 years. He was killed rather more nobly by his enemies, dying bravely, and in spite of his flaws, which included raiding northeast of England and tearing down the homes of hermits to repair his ships and so on, became a saint, and his cult lasted for a while, both at the place of his death and the church where his body lay overnight. A well sprung up, and many people said they were cured of their ailments there, until somebody put down it the boilings of a dog, and that seems to have killed the saint, killed off the miracles. But others, like Brenda the Navigator, in his story travelled right across Europe, of his journeys across fantastical Western islands, not the Scotland of his earlier stories, with a certain degree of theological content and translated into some 15 languages. Columcille had this very early life by Adamnon, only 100 years after his death, and this used both a written source but also memories. 100 years is not that long in a society which wants to recall stories. He was, of course, a royal saint, came with 12 companions like Christ, one of the key saints of Ireland. Roles: spiritual advisor, help of penitents, miracle worker. He spoke to kings, banisher of a monster, though I have to say many of the saints of this period did the same. Writer, transmitter of works, model for his followers, and advisor. Spoken through Adamnon's admiring eyes. The book is arranged in 3 sections of prophecies, healing miracles, and his conversing with angels. And while I'd highly recommend the very accessible translation of his Latin life by Richard Sharp, which is $8.99 in Penguin Classics, please don't be deterred by the thickness of this 400-page book. The actual life itself is only 150 pages. Some of the stories we find again used by Odhran, his biographer, again and again. Stories of protector of women come back, of cows and milk. All of these have a background which we can look at. I've put in the nunnery. This is the high medieval nunnery because I've written about it recently. But a recent lecture by Catherine Forsyth has knitted together the both archaeological and place name and personal name, very delicate evidence to suggest there was quite a long-lasting early Christian monastery or nunnery on Iona. And here are some of the aspects of it, and some of the things we associate, like the simple stones, the high crosses, the imagery upon them, the Book of Kells, which is associated with Iona and has a direct link with some of the iconography on the high crosses. This one is a replica outside the rebuilt Columba shrine. This is getting to a central part of the monastery, the part which pilgrims would have visited down the centuries. And modelled on that, perhaps we get things like the small reliquaries. This is the one in the National Museum of Scotland. Columba, according to Adamnon, was a provider. He had foreknowledge, all the attributes of a saint. Not content with this, we of course have a 12th century vernacular life of St. Columba, which I have to say is pretty dull. The only thing I remember distinctly about it is that it says that Columba came to Iona out of love of God and for the people of the West, rather of people of Scotland, rather than the later and very popular version today, which is that he was cast out for causing a battle in Ireland. Then finally, we come in the 16th century to an even fuller version of the life of St. Columba by Manus O'Donnell, a prince of Donegal, who actually would see himself as having been part of the same family as Columba and protected by him. One of the rather beautiful stories, if you like it, is that he says that the relics of St. Columba, the cachag, the Batla, which was the reliquary, the shrine holding what turned out to be a psalter, which is as old enough to have been written by Columba himself, was carried around the forces of the O'Donnells before battle to ensure victory, and it usually worked. We may also recall that either this or another reliquary of Columba was carried around the forces at Bannockburn, also to ensure victory. So it must have worked sometimes. The Manus O'Donnell collected a whole range of stories, folkloric, developed, built upon by earlier biographers, and compiled them. He was writing in the early age of print, and he certainly intended his extensive work to be published. And so some of the stories, so he actually, unusually for his period, gave a name on it. One story he tells has been, in a sanitized version, become part of the popular tellings of stories of St. Columba on Iona today. And this is why he left Ireland, where he was already famous as founder of monasteries, to settle on Iona. This is about a psalter. But while still in Ireland, he borrowed a psalter from St. Finian and secretly copied it at night in the church. On the third night, Finian sent a boy to fetch the psalter. The boy looked through a hole in the door and saw a book being copied by light coming out of Columba's fingers. The saint became aware of the boy and sent his pet crane to swoop down on the hole and pluck out the boy's eye. Fortunately, St. Finian healed him, and that bit is expurgated from modern versions of this story. When Finian received the original back, he demanded a copy made without his consent. Columba disputed this, as no harm had been done to the original, and the word of God was to be spread. It went to judgment, and the judgment went against Columba. To every cow its calf, to every book its copy, which may have been important to Manus O'Donnell about copies of his own book. As a calf follows its mother cow, so the copy goes with the original. And Columba continued to dispute this, and it led to this great battle at Culdrefna in what's now Sligo, at which many died. Columba, deep in penitence, was told that Archangel Michael would, God would not abandon him, and so on. And it seems to have again led to the story that he left as a penitent for Ireland, very much highly developed from what was told in the story in Adamnon's much, much earlier life of some 900 years earlier. Of that story too, cranes are associated with St. Columba or Columcille in various stories. So we have that. We have work being done at present on the situational aspects. This is part of the Book of Kells, which see the actual church here. Christ is the apex, actually part of the church. Seems to be based on the earlier stories. I put in that as that is a late classical version of the Cross of Christ with the laurel wreath of victory, which we often see associated in freestanding stone in the high crosses. That's Matthew Cross, which I will leave for now. That one again is for a separate talk. And that I put in simply as it is part of the Iona Psalter, which seems to have been compiled about year 1200 for a nun interested in Iona saints. And back to Columcille, because that's the modern period. The stories continue. Down the years, remaking saints, loss of some, the extension of others. And while we may not get to the bottom of them historically, in tracking their stories down the years, we do get to know what concerned people at the time of writing and the collating of stories around them. In the case of Columcille, it went on down the years. As I said previously, the custodians of Iona in the 18th century were certain he was Scottish and certainly died and was buried here. And if the Irish were saying his bones were in Ireland, it was lies. 18th century, of course, saw religious tourism, and Iona got many visitors who wrote up and sketched what they saw. By the late 19th century, Catholics and Protestants both owned Iona. But fortunately, the rebuilding, when mooted, led to good compromise. Modern versions include George MacLeod's saints as models, especially St. Martin of Tours and Columba. He was a very good storyteller, and when he ran out of anything he had read, he made it up. William Sharp, writer as Fiona MacLeod, also added to common traditions and the sanitized stories of the Psalters and others appeared. But to return to Columba, to Margaret, a much later saint, I'll skip over these ones. A rather lovely cow carved in the 15th century in the crossing of Iona Abbey, which refers, I think, to a story in the life of St. Columba by Adamnon, where Columba's own cow, which he used to feed his cats, was stolen. He prayed to God, and the cow was returned to him. In the far corner, you may not see here, is a man in poor clothing raising his hands to heaven. Well, we have this unfortunate cow being dragged off, pulled by the tail, dragged by the head towards a man with a hatchet waiting, so its fate is obvious. It's a cow in full milk, and it's would very much have associated with the poor and the others seeing it from the nave in a time of endemic cattle raiding. The raiders are wearing the latest fashionable clothes, perhaps not available to the poor who could associate with Columba, and ask him to intercede with God on their behalf. Above, we see a hunting dog chasing a hare being one of the common symbolic references to Christ, escaping from the snare of a hunter, as the psalm says. Not all is clear. Another time I may speak of two unusual, though very worn, figures on Iona. This is a shin and a gig, which I believe is there to ward off magic, a ward off evil, and very, very faint here from about very, very late 15th century is a very small green man. Above is the cross of Christ, and then the mitre of the abbot, protection of St. Columba, and below this wonderful image of renewal and life beyond the death. So My hour is up. Thank you. I am sorry to have rushed it. And please comment, critique, and tell me about all the local saints as you would. I'm going to try and remove my stop sharing so there can be discussion or debate should any wish it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rosemary. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, but if anyone has any questions, by all means, put them into the chat, or you can also raise your hand, or you can actually click on the reaction button at the bottom of your screen if you want to raise your hand. But I'll read out a couple of questions if people are okay with that. One from Philippa Dobson. She asks, how many Bridgets were there, do you think? Interesting that they are associated with fire as well.
Right. As a saint, you get one, but then Gobnet in the south of Ireland has many of her attributes as a local saint. Gobnet is, the word behind it is Gower, blacksmith. So you have a female blacksmith saint. Fire, definitely. The blessed fire at Kildare, which was spoken of in the 12th century by a usually quite hostile commentator. I don't think we can doubt that was continuing, and that was an external fire. That wasn't for practical lighting or heating purposes. It was obviously for another purpose. Brig, the deity behind the Brigantines and other, we assume, and other tribes met by the Romans in Britannia, is presumably from the same goddess. I don't have no doubt at all that there was a deity figure behind it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she wasn't herself a historical figure in essence, named after an older figure. She was one of the very early saints of Ireland. So she has been the subject of numerous academic theses, but reality is it's very difficult to cast any judgment of how much belongs to one and how much to other. In folk tradition, she is extremely popular. Bridget's night, the 1st of February, Bridget's Eve, night before, in Donegal, you would certainly get a first footing, Bridget's crosses, of which there were numerous versions, local versions made of rushes. New one would be placed on the hearth, the old one would be burnt. One would be put in the shed to protect the cows in particular. She's associated with butter, milk, provision. This, of course, being absolute essential food in early Ireland, and at a time of year when cows are dry on the whole, or drying up. So I yeah, she would certainly be actively present. And I mean, even where I lived in County Clare, there was a very, very active holy well associated with her.
Have Ireland announced that her Saints' Day is a national holiday now? Am I right in saying that?
It's not a holiday, but it's very widely marked.
Well, I thought it was going to be a holiday. I'm all for more holidays, if you haven't guessed. But
absolutely, well, your Middle Ages would have suited you.
It has been designated as a new holiday for Ireland. Yes,
has it been designated? All right, good. There you are.
We're getting the holiday tomorrow, but from here on, the extra holiday tomorrow. But from here on, it will be 1st of February.
There you are.
You're not getting a holiday taken away. You know, you're not going to have to work on Christmas or anything like that. That's not going to happen.
No. No sleight of hand.
Excellent.
Another thing in Donegal, it was a time when at least the first cutting with the plough was made for the new, even if it was a ritual, at least beginning of the ploughing.
Right,
then I'm sure Hubert has put down a few potatoes today. Haven't you, Hubert? Have you not put down some potatoes today?
Not today.
Right.
I couldn't do it on the on St. Patrick's Day, it wouldn't be lucky.
Ah.
It might be irreverent to the man himself, or the saint.
Oh, well, it's different parts and different traditions on that one. Yeah. I'm just trying to look down through the.
Yeah, we've got another one from I think it is Neil MacLeod. He says Adamnon, Columcilla's biographer, had a chapel dedicated to him in Stornoway, now lost. But here he is known as Saint Lenin or Linain. I'm sure I butchered how to say that. How did the name become altered from Adamnon to Lenin? Was there a particular cult related to Adamnon?
There were certainly cults of Adamnon, both here and in Donegal. In modern Irish, he's usually Yunan. The name has sort of been evolved into a simpler form. I mean, Adamnon itself means something like the little holy terror, the little great big fury. It's a fascinating name. It's one of a number of names of these early saints, which is apotreic. It wards off evil forces when the baby's in the cradle. It's like Senan of County Clare is little old man. Odhran is, I've forgotten what Odhran is. Odhran's pretty dreadful. Yeah.
Is it connected with the well, Odhran?
There's a number of Odhrans. One of the great sources for this modern sort of initial reference is a book which is now 10 years old by Pádraig Ó Rian called A Dictionary of Irish Saints. Unfortunately, he only includes ones from Scotland if they had a head start in Ireland. Even so, it's a vast tome. There are numerous. I mean, there is an Odhran of County Waterford who later on the Norsemen of Waterford took on as their patron. It seems unlikely he's the same saint. There is the Odhran who came with Columba to Iona, according to Adamnon, who's probably a fairly good record. Is that the same Odhran as in Oronsay? Holy wells, yeah. But then again, when's a well a holy well? Quite a lot of them were also the local water supply. A pure source of water would itself have been a blessing. I mentioned the story Adamnon and Iona. I think I can hold this up. This is your Penguin Classic, as available through places like Waterstones Oban. It's by Richard Sharp, who has very recently died. Translation from the Latin. A fascinating introduction and notes, which take up most of the book, actually. But the stories themselves put out in very, very readable form in English. So that's one which I would recommend among many. I'm just trying to see what other notes there were out. Somebody's mentioned that the Gnostic stories. I totally agree, but in the Middle Ages, you still have stories like Jesus and the Birds in folk ballads. Just because they were not part of the canon doesn't mean they vanished entirely. They were still taken as charming stories. So they would have been around, as so many are. Blessed are the cheesemakers, right? We know what generation that person belongs to. Thank you, Patrick. I've been looking for little available at St. Marnock. I would love to know, Susan Surwine. I can't at this stage, but if you come back to me, I will have something. Every Irish townland is a St. Bridget's well, or the marks for stones on knees on a stone, I'd say, apart from County Kerry, where they have Goblet instead. Sheena Nagig, goddess of fertility. I have written on this, on the Iona Sheena Nagig particularly, and I think the best argument for them is apotreic magic to frighten off the devil in particular, where you find them on religious buildings. The fertility issue has been raised, but from only about 1900. So I think I would have to say I would consider that to be a modern construction. Another interpretation has been tempted, but it's a warning against the sin of lust. Though that brings on problems of who's being warned when you look at where they are and indeed why. And there are 6 other deadly sins, and to a medieval mind, the main sin of men was avarice. Of women, it was lust. And then, of course, you have the other ones, pride, gluttony. Come on, somebody can tell me. What are the 7 deadly sins? Kenneth is thinking hard. Right. I'm sure there's somewhere in the chat.
You know I'm a good person, Rosemary, so I couldn't name a single one, I'm afraid.
Pride, envy, gluttony, lust, avarice. I've got a fair one. There's quite a few anyway.
Actually, no, that is basically a Saturday night for me. I apologise. That's right.
Okay,
we do have. I think we've got another question about St Comgall, which I actually did a wee post about on Facebook, because the only mention, or the only chapel or ecclesiastical site that I could find in Argyll associated with St Patrick was on the island of Tiree, in the southwest of the island at Baleful. It's Temple Patrick, but this appears to be potentially founded by St Comgall. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, St Comgall, known for the founder of many monasteries and teacher of Columba. Could you tell us about him, please?
All right. Could I just start with Columbanus? He was a rather later saint. It's the same name, but it's a distinguishing one. He was also from he studied at Bangor, but he's very well referenced because he wrote an awful lot which has survived. But he was a saint of the continent of Europe rather than, locally. Comgall is one of the ones who's associated with them. Off the top of my head, I don't know very much, but I mean, Padraig O'Rian in his book would have a great deal about him, which I have read at one stage. There is a difference between a founding saint and a church dedicated to another saint. And it's also, once you get a saint called Patrick, you're going to get no end of other people calling their little boys Patrick. In fact, you've even west of Iceland acquired a 11th century Saint Patrick, but whether he's the same one or a copy of it, we don't know. So I think Ken can very well answer this one, having written about it from his blog. So over to you, Ken.
I'm afraid I am in no way able to answer that, although I did read a little bit from a paper which really talks about Tiree, but it does give a kind of potted history or potted life of Comgall. And there's a paper or a manuscript called A Latin Life of Comgall, but it's by Michael Meckler, and it's called Carnal Love and Priestly Ordination on 6th Century Tiree. So people might want to read that. That came out about 20 years ago. And I'll maybe put that into the chat because actually it seemed very interesting. But I only kind of skim read it for to use or kind of to discuss the Tiree connection to Patrick. But yeah, I'll put that into the chat if anyone wants to read, because it is actually a very interesting paper. I'll try and get the link sent in. But there is a few more questions below there. If you've got it there, you can feel free to answer.
I've got one from Charlotte, fascinated about pilgrim paths and local places like Columba's Cave on the way to Scattery and Columba's Footprints, South End. Encourage people to Argyll and to what extent these are visited by Columba or designated by locals. Certainly designated by locals. Whether they were visited or not is probably lost. Though the first point of call would be to see if there was anything in the Adamnon's life of St. Columba which suggested they might have been sometimes we'll get very ambiguous aspects, like the endless arguments about where the island of Hinbar is. But pilgrim paths themselves are considerable fascination at present. In some cases, because they may be archaeologically delicate, particularly if there is a historical evidence that this was one of the paths chosen. And of course, we're talking about centuries. The paths could change down the centuries, just as rivers change course, or people, this part of the country is unwelcoming, so we may as well go the other side of the mountains, and up Lahore side, for example, because we know there are hostelries we can stay at and people will be nice to us, and so on, or whatever it is. But where they've survived, and many of them might be under tarmac, the possibility that there is an archaeological sensitivity is really important. On the other hand, on a modern way, there has been a long movement for now, 15 years now, to develop a pilgrim path where possible upon ancient raids from Donegal. Garton is associated with being the birthplace of St. Columba, through to Iona. And this, of course, would be through Kintyre and upwards. Before we got dependent on ferries, this, of course, you would have found a local person to make a sea crossing for you in a group and presumably paid them jointly. So yes, I think these are aspects which I am fascinated myself, and if Charlotte would like to get in touch, I'd like to continue the conversation with her, particularly in this part of the world.
Yeah, you might want to put your email address, your contact details into the chat. I'm sure people have got lots of questions and to follow up on, so feel free to put.
I'll just put that in case, yes. Mm-hmm.
And while you're doing that, we have. I just wanted to mention something that Patrick said, which I think people need to know about. Kilpeck in Herefordshire not only has some amazing shield gigs, but also the first known depiction of Welshmen in trousers. So thanks for that little nugget there, Patrick. That is great.
Yeah, it has one shield gig, very, very engaging and very, very explicit. I have been there and have seen it in some detail. So it's rather charming, the whole setup at Kilpeck, and wonderfully preserved for those who want that to explore the things. There's one from Neil. Sorry.
So I think I was going to say the same. Neil MacLeod. Is that who you were going to answer as well? Go for it.
Right, cult related to St. Clement, which Vikings or somebody exported to the eastern seaboard of England, also the Netherlands and Germany. There's a chapel to Clement on the north end of Lewis at Northdale, and of course famously at Riddle and Harris. Any in the Hebrides or Ireland? I don't know, but of course there is a continental St. Clement as well, isn't there? So is it an import to the Isles? And if so, why? Or is it the other direction? Any thoughts, Neil MacLeod? With the pilgrim path, saints were very much passed around and taken to other areas. Again, in my own period, the Norse period, you have chapels to Olaf, the patron saint of Norway, who died in battle, in most of the towns where you would have had Norwegian seafarers, understandably enough, like Dublin, or well, certainly there's one in London that's still active. Peggy Rogers, adultery. Peggy Rogers has mentioned adultery. I'm not entirely sure of the context.
I think this is
we're back on
the sins. Yeah. So we had a deluge of sins coming in here. So just skip past that because it's all rude stuff.
Several people have noticed sloth.
Patrick going political there, which is brilliant. Peter Herbert has asked what progress is being made in the more obscure Scottish saints and or dedications, which is a great question. So many are tied up in place names. In Kilmarnock Church, we have at least 3 saints. One is Fillan, so well known. However, Kilmarnock itself obscures a possible connection to Carrock of Llyrcavan. I'm not going to, that's a Welsh name that I'm not going to try and pronounce. I think it's the sound that I won't be able to get. But now the lost Eggleston and Eggles Church, that has quite an extraordinary varied spelling history. Quite a long point here. Both places lie on our own Anetburn, a unique combination of church names, not forgetting the more modern Kirkton. Also lying hard by the Anet, life and our saints complex. So I guess if you answer the original point, which is what progress has been made in the more obscure Scottish saints and or dedications, that'd be great.
Well, if I may just go to the end, I say the life and our saints are very complex. Yes, of course, Anet, of course, is an ancient church site name, not much used in Ireland. Eggles, like the Irish Uglish, ultimately comes from ecclesia, the Latin for church, so we've got that one. Kill, of course, is originally the cell, the small place where the hermit or other lived. So you know you've got these names from the past. I think the movement on saints is slow because there's a great deal of work and very detailed work to be done in each subject, and of course you need to have a fairly good grounding in several disciplines. Place names, of course. I think local geography is vital. If you're going to have a place, look at it, consider what it would have looked like in the period in question. Has the river changed? Probably the hills have been denuded, there might have been erosion, whatever. Why would somebody settle there? Is it, could they actually make a living out of it? Is there fishing? Is it somewhere they could raise crops? And so on. Or is it somewhere which can be on a travelling route so they can get the wherewithal to live from that? And of course, the history, the sources, the source material, mostly in Latin, but in other languages too. So it's going slowly. But I think the main thing is if there are people who've got a local interest, they can kickstart that and work with the institutions to develop it. And there are many people nowadays who are doing higher degrees, often on subjects like this, who can be a marvellous link between the local community and the academic world on sourcing and developing this. And of course, within that is a place for the museums.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with you. I'm a big fan of Pilgrim's Paths as well, just because it also gets people outside and experiencing landscapes in a new way, in more detail, a kind of more considered and thoughtful way to take in where you live or where you want to visit. So I think it's a really great thing. We've got time for probably about 2 more questions, I think. Right. We've got one from Matt.
Yes.
Who says,
I'll come back to that. I've just noticed that I put in my email address. It's Rosemary Power. It shouldn't be question mark. It should be at. That's right. A trick that has been played with it. And Hubert, thank you, has given us the whole list of deadly sins. But Kesog, rather ephemeral. I don't know much on the subject. Again, I think it is one that, looking at the place, where exactly is he most associated with? He's more to a name to me. Is that Matt? No, perhaps Matt's gone. But again, I'll try and sort out any sources that I can find for him.
Matt is still here, but while he's typing away there, there's one from Des actually who also asks about another saint. Any word on Saint Maher of Aberdeen, patron of Malin or Malin Well Old Church in Innishowen?
I expect to be there next week in Newmacher, and I will certainly see if I have any local information. But I can't partake, obviously. Yes, somebody, as Neil McLeod pointed out, Clement was a Pope Clement, whether it's the same name or sometimes when you have a Gallic name, but you're writing in Latin, as you know, you will give it a form like Clementius, something that sounds similar. So again, that would be a nice one to look at, see if it is different saints. Balak na Crossa, the mouth of the cross. There's a Pilgrim's Trail. Kenneth is speaking of a Northern Pilgrim's Way. This is Macher of Aberdeen, yes. As I said, I hope to come back with more information next week. I'm really sorry the COVID has knocked me out with all this kind of thing. Search all country churches for green men as well as Sheen the gigs. Green men are inclined to be English, though there are, I think, 5 in Orkney Cathedral, which seems to have English masons. That's why it's quite unusual to have this one late on Iona. Sheen the gig, I have a paper in Folklore 2012, specifically on the Iona one and the development of understanding of what they are. I also edit the journal in the County Clare, and have written for that on them and the sort of later development of them. They seem to have been, the stone ones seem to have ceased to be carved in, say, the late 16th century. They survive usually the stone ones on churches, but also in domestic buildings. Right. Neil MacLeod has written about some unfortunate saint who was attached to an anchor and drowned, but I've lost the thread, Neil. So I can't see where you started. No. Association saints, hermits and caves. I think living a very ascetic life, you had to live in some kind of shelter. And like many people of the past, if there was a natural formation, it's a good place to start. Sometimes very ancient places were used, but we do know of later folk traditions of even dolmens being used as places of shelter protection by homeless people. So you have those. Oh, green men in Rosslyn chapels. Yes, that's one which is absolutely littered with them, isn't it? But yeah.
Wonderful. I think that's probably all that we've got time for, actually. That was really, really brilliant talk. Thank you very much, Rosemary. And I think the conversations afterwards really reflect how interesting the talk was, but how we still have a fascination with saints and with early Christianity in Scotland and Ireland. I mean, it seems to share so much, and it seems to be a different world as well when you talk about boiled dogs and eyes being plucked out of young boys' heads and everything. So really quite visceral, but I think a kind of an important insight into the past. So at this stage, what I like to do, if you might all indulge me on St. Patrick's Day, is to turn your camera on, and you can unmute yourself now. What I like to do is take a little picture of everyone who has attended, because it's nice to see smiling faces. And if you want to unmute yourself at this point, you absolutely can, because it's nice to, pretend that we are back in normality. We're back in, 6th century AD Iona, and we're enraptured by Rosemary's talk. And we'd like to show her a bit of appreciation and give her a round of applause. So thank you very much, Rosemary.
Thank you tonight.
Thank you so much. That was really great. So all that leaves me to say is I hope everybody has a brilliant remainder of their St. Patrick's day or night. Just to let you know that next month, our next talk is going to be on Thursday, the 21st of April. It's going to feature Dr. Angela Boyle, an osteoarchaeologist, who's going to be discussing violence between the 5th and 8th centuries AD in southeast Scotland. So if you'd like to sign up to that, just head on to our website, www.kilmartin.org, and you can sign up to the evening talks there. And just one more reminder that these talks are free, but it does cost us a little bit of money to put them on just so we can host so many people. So if you'd like to make a wee donation, that is much appreciated. It goes towards our redevelopment. But that's all for just now. Like I say, enjoy the rest of your St. Patrick's night and enjoy the rest of your weekend as well. So good night, everybody, and cheerio.